All right, so part 6 of the Vince McMahon documentary on Netflix, Mr. McMahon. I had been reading that this is the best part, and I will tell you that it almost is. It's such a more impactful and powerful episode than the previous 5, especially the previous 3. As I mentioned in previous reviews, the stories that were told in the in episodes 3, 4, and 5, if you're a hardcore wrestling fan, you know the majority of them. It was still good to see Vince get challenged on a few of these things, but it was, it's nothing too groundbreaking. There was a few things here and there, but nothing too groundbreaking. But this is where things really get, as they say, spicy. And when I say spicy, I also mean disturbing, because, part 6 covers a lot of ground. Because the previous part, they spent so much time covering the 90s, the Monday Night War, and the aftermath after that, that with this particular episode, they really had to go from like ruthless aggression era all the way to now, to 2024. And that's many years to cover. So there were a ton of things that got sort of glossed over. And that, I think, is one of the flaws of this documentary series, is that it does feel unbalanced. I'm not sure if maybe they wanted to make the documentary series originally more parts or less parts, but they could have gone in on deeper aspects and asked deeper questions on some things and left other things out. I mentioned in the episode 5 documentary, or the episode 5 review, that they went a little bit too much on Hogan Rock. Even though I understand how big that match was, it wasn't really too centered on Vince McMahon. This final episode really covered not just the current stuff, but the most controversial topics of the entire thing. I mean, the steroid trial and the sex scandal and everything, all that stuff sort of was an appetizer compared to like everything, kind of wrapping up here. Like part 6, I will say this, part 6, after watching it, I now understand why they spent so much time with the Shane McMahon story. Now, I wasn't complaining about that necessarily because it was compelling, but I understand now why so much of the stuff with Shane and Stephanie and the succession of the lineage of the company was discussed. And it wasn't just because this part obviously covers the Endeavor sale, although again, not as in-depth as you would think. Still, they had to cram a lot into this episode, and part of me kind of wishes they would have added another episode and kind of given this more time to breathe, although I sort of understand why they didn't. Still, though, I wonder if maybe it would have been a good idea to do that. And we know that there's a lot more footage. So I would not be surprised, because remember, the story with Janelle Grant and Vince McMahon, that's still an ongoing story. The lawsuit's been put on hold because there's a federal investigation going on. But we could easily, next year, the year after, Netflix, regardless of the deal they made with WWE, could continue and publish this story, like more episodes with more interviews if they wanted to. I mean, I don't know what else they have, there. So this documentary picks up in 2007, a very, very famous year for wrestling. And at first they cover the Battle of the Billionaires. And it's Donald Trump and Vince McMahon. And it's very positive in the sense of like, things. It was a big show, WrestleMania 23. Very big for the business. But then things take a dark turn as they start talking about the Mr. McMahon is Dead storyline, which would, of course, take us into the Chris Benoit story. They talk about the concussions. They interview Chris Nowinsky, which was a very refreshing to hear him on this. And they talk about all the different deaths under Vince's watch and what throughout the years. What I found strange is they interview Steve Austin about CTE, which we now know for sure is a real thing. And he's over here saying he doesn't believe in it. So I don't know if he's just skeptical or what. And I know that some people are going to take that and maybe think he's being ignorant. And I guess that is a form of ignorance. It's just, part of me wonders if Austin had kept wrestling, if he didn't have the career-ending neck injury, if he had continued to wrestle, would he have developed CTE himself? It's a very big possibility he would have. Now, while they're talking about the whole CTE thing, right, and Chris Nowinsky and the concussions, first of all, they show some nasty footage that I don't even remember. Talking about stuff where Benoit got dropped on the top of his head by, at one point, A-Train / Lord Tensai, and at another point, Billy Gunn, even though that one wasn't so bad as the A-Train one. That one looked nasty. They actually fast forward to 2014 and discuss Lesnar and Taker and how Vince changed the finish the day of. And Vince is quoted as saying he does not, I mean, he says it, he does not think Taker got a concussion. He thinks Taker was traumatized that he was losing the streak, which, that's a stretch, man, because you can see, if you watch that match, there's a part in that match, and it isn't that far into the match, where Taker looks like he's still hanging in there, but a bit confused. I do think he had a concussion. I'm not an expert, but having Vince say that was a little bit weird, but it did lead to a rare W for Vince in this documentary because Vince listened to Nowinsky. Vince volunteered to help Nowinsky and to learn from Chris Nowinsky about CTE, and they did change a lot of the policies. So that's a rare W for Vince in this case, in this series, because this series, I don't know if I'm going to call it a hit piece. I'm not sure if I want to go that far with it, but it certainly was skewed negative. However, with the material and the story, can you really blame them, especially what came out in the last 2 years? So then they go into the PG era and the women's evolution, the women's revolution. Now, the PG era stuff was more about the business moves and why they did it. The women's evolution, they sort of credit it to right around the same time when you had like Candice Michelle, Beth Phoenix, and granted, these women, you know, Mickie James, they were taken much more seriously as performers for the most part, not entirely, than, you know, the Attitude Era when it was all eye candy. But the women's revolution didn't really begin until 2014 with Bayley and Sasha, NXT Brooklyn, and those, you know, the horsewomen really changing the game. That's when it really kicked in. So then they skip forward again. They go into Shane McMahon's return in 2016 and the match with Taker. And this whole story was about Shane trying to prove to his dad and to prove himself to his dad. And it actually discusses, like, and it interviews other wrestlers talking about how they view Vince as a father figure. And again, that part is nothing new to wrestling fans. And they kind of go back to Shane wanting to become a successor. And I like this because the last few minutes of episode 5 were all about this. Now we have Shane coming back in 2016, trying to pick up where he left off and improve things. And it's interesting because Tony Atlas says that he thought that Shane was just too nice to be the boss because Vince, you know, was not a nice guy at all times. So then they kind of skip ahead again and they go into various like successful things like social media, the big TV deals that they got, the WWE Network and the Peacock deal, and they even showed footage of AEW and how there was competition. It was one shot of AEW and Cody Rhodes, and then he went back to WWE. They did not show a lot of AEW. But I'm still surprised to see it. So then they go into this segment where they talk about Vince. Vince was asked if he sees himself retiring, and he says no. He doesn't understand why people retire. Now, there's a lot of entrepreneurs who have said that. And I understand if you're an entrepreneur who loves what he does, there's no reason for you to retire because it's not work to you. And that's discussed on here as well. But a lot of people don't work at jobs they love. A lot of folks work at hard jobs, stressful jobs, physically demanding jobs, and you break down. And the more physically demanding it is, the faster you break down. So the idea of a guy like this to understand people wanting to retire, it's weird. He's saying you never stop growing. you can retire and still grow as a person, but somebody like Vince McMahon is wired different because he's an entrepreneur. Plus, he's got access to things that we don't have access to. Now, they asked the wrestlers if they think he would retire, and they all say no. So then we get to what I would say is the main event. The finish is what this episode was called, and that is summer of 2022, the story of the affairs, Vince being defiant, and on the screen it says that when this happened, Vince canceled his final interviews for the series when this became public, with the whole thing at the Wall Street Journal. So with Vince gone, and a lot of the wrestling interviews being prior to this, 2021, some parts of 2022, they interview the reporters who were covering this, and they discuss a lot of the different allegations from the different women. More and more started coming in when it was published. The $12 million hush money story. And then suddenly Vince retires on Twitter and Stephanie opens the show. Now, a lot of people at this point start discussing Vince coming back, which he did come back in January of 2023 when he pulled the power move with the board of directors. And I remember that being a very complex story because I don't think a lot of people understood that even though WWE is public and even though there is a board of directors that has to unanimously vote on something, because Vince had the majority of the shares, he gets the majority of the voting power, which means that even though it may seem like a democracy, it's really not. He has final say on everything. So he came back to WWE to facilitate the sale. We all know that. And they didn't go into like the fact that the WWE, and I've talked about this before on social media and in podcasts and things like that. WWE, the rumors of WWE being sold to, there was rumors of Disney and, Warner Brothers. There's all kinds of different NBC, different people that were supposedly interested, right? Those rumors popped up around 2020, 2021, like maybe even 2019. Like that was, and nobody believed it then. Now, Meltzer speculates that Stephanie talked Vince into quitting, and then when Vince came back, Steph left right away. And he has a right to make that observation because it makes sense. Vince steps down, she comes in, then Vince comes back, she steps down. It feels like Steph kind of became like Shane, realizing that Vince was not going to leave. And that's why I say that the stuff they talked about in episode 5 made way more sense here. Like if the events didn't play out the way that they did in the real world, because sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right? It's interesting because the whole story was, would Vince ever give this up to Shane? And the answer was no. And then what about Stephanie and Triple H? And Meltzer's over here assuming that, well, maybe Steph was the one that kind of said, hey, maybe you do got to go this time. But Vince didn't really want to. Of course, Bruce Pritchard says Meltzer has no idea what he's talking about because he wasn't there. And there is truth to that. Meltzer was not there. But again, that observation from Meltzer makes sense. So then they talk about the current big boom and how things are better without Vince. Now, what they end up doing is they end up bringing Meltzer and Bruce Pritchard back in 2024 for recent interviews, early in 2024. Bruce is interviewed and they ask him, because apparently he saw a couple of episodes, and he says he didn't like the documentary, made him look bad. And that's probably why Conrad recently was saying that, well, it's a hit piece, because Bruce is obviously Conrad's co-host and they obviously talk as friends. So, of course, he's going to say stuff. So Bruce talks about that Vince has a human side. He talks about how Vince helped his wife with her cancer. Bruce's wife had cancer. Vince made sure she got the best doctors. Vince is a very complicated man, and a complex man, because I'm sure that's true. And if my wife was diagnosed with cancer and my boss paid to have the best doctors look at her, and she was given 2 years left to live and she's still alive 24 years later, I would probably be extremely loyal to that man for the rest of my life too. You cannot blame Bruce for this, dude. It makes sense. But then, literally 2 days later, the Janelle Grant lawsuit is filed. The timing of all of this is absolutely nutty. So Janelle Grant was the woman who they reported on back in 2022. And this is where all the nasty stuff came out. The defecation, the restraint, the sex toys named after wrestlers, the threesomes, the text messages. And as of right now, the story's still unresolved. Now, I actually had people visiting me when this story broke during that weekend, because the Royal Rumble was in St. Pete that weekend, and I went to that show. People were literally with me here in my house and we're all wrestling fans, finding out about this craziness, right? Vince was asked to resign by Ari Emanuel. They don't really go into that. In fact, the sale thing is like less than a minute. They show the scene of Vince and Ari together on that news thing. I forget, I watched it when it aired. You know, that right there, like they definitely just wasn't a big deal. It was not a big deal. Now, they cover the Ashley Mazzaro stuff, which I was not expecting, but they did. And the stories that were coming out about other performers and all that. So the final sort of segment is about Vince's legacy. And even before all this came about, a lot of the wrestlers had a very hard time giving a straight answer. Cena, Undertaker, Trish, Booker T seemed to be kind of taken aback by the question. Because I think that prior to 2022, Vince's legacy, despite all the scandals, because it had been somewhat quiet for a while, Vince would have had a positive legacy, I would say, because in time, stories blow over. But this, and I said this when it first broke, this Janelle Grant lawsuit, and you know, we were reading like the text messages here together. You know, my friends and I were. And it's like, dude, hold up. Like, this has put a black eye on Vince's legacy. And it was a very poetic ending because they basically say, like, you know, wrestling's always been good guys versus bad guys. Vince McMahon has proven that's not how it is. There's good people, there's good sides to people, and there's bad sides to people. And he says that, and it was very intelligently said. Like, Vince did a lot of great things in business and for the business, but he also did a lot of bad things. And that is objectively true. So it is what it is, man. So this last part of the documentary, completely worth it. To be honest, part of me wants to tell you to skip to this one and just watch this. And honestly, if you did that, I don't think you'd be missing too much. Episode 1 and episode 6 are the two best episodes. 2 was good too, but 3, 4, and 5, again, if you know the business, you know it all. If you don't know anything, or if you're a casual, or if you just know a little bit of things, I would recommend watching the entire thing. I know a lot of wrestling fans are not liking this documentary, but again, it's wrestling fans who know all the stories. If you already know the story, it's not that compelling. But this last episode was super captivating, and I'm going to say this. This is how I kind of feel about it. The last 30 minutes of episode 6 made me feel a lot of complex emotions. I don't know if this was quite as gross as like the Netflix R. Kelly documentary, but my God, like someone who legit watched Vince for 35 years on TV, it's very dark for me and very complex. And, you know, people throw insults on the internet. Like, people fling insults at each other now using the P word. And, you know, it's so disgusting because in the real world, we have actual predators and people like this in the real world that take advantage of people because of their position or actually go further than that against people's will. And yet that word is thrown around like it's nothing on the internet by trolls when it's like, dude, you're making some pretty harsh statements about another person you don't know. Like, and this documentary just kind of opened my eyes even more to that. So I do recommend watching part 6 no matter what. No matter what. Like, from Benoit to, they skipped a lot, and I understand why, but from Benoit all the way to the Janelle Grant thing. And again, this story is not finished yet. Federal investigation going on. The lawsuit's been suspended. And that story's going to take a bunch of twists and turns. Do they go to court? Do they settle? I don't know, but... Man, we may see a part 2. We may see, like with the R. Kelly documentary, we may see a sequel, like, set of episodes. But how's that going to work when Raw is on Netflix? See, again, no, Vince is not in WWE anymore, but Vince did create Raw. So, and a lot of the guys on that roster, Vince gave their first pieces of fame to. So, it's going to be complex. Leave your comments about what you thought down below. Maybe I'll do a compilation video of all of this in one big video, but until then, I'm sure I'll have more to say on it, with the fallout of this, if something happens. We'll see. Again, the story's unresolved. Or not unresolved, it's still ongoing, and unresolved in some ways. Anyways, man, take care. See you guys soon.